a sentence at a time, a sentence of text, and for that text, the system comes up with a melody. So something to which you can sing these lyrics, let's say here. This idea of creating melodies that organically fit with the lyrics is the whole point of Elysia. It's sort of learning this relationship between melodies and text directly from the corpus. That's the heart of Elysia. And another way in which it's kind of conceptually different from some closely related work is that it works bottom up instead of top down. We're not trying to create complete autonomous music. What we're trying to do is to help people create songs who perhaps can't do it otherwise. And the approach is to create smaller chunks. So the system doesn't, it might appear like it doesn't do as much, but to do it well. So in this case, to create short melodies for text that a musician might actually want to incorporate in their music. So sort of a little bit of a quality versus quantity. Okay, so for the next 7 or 10 slides, Chris is going to take over.
So the overall arcing system for this is designed this way. So what we do is that we get the data and we extract the feature matrix from the music MXL file. We have 3 different models in random forest. It's an octave, rhythm, and melody model. Once data is split between the training and the testing set, we train the models. Then we evaluate based on the test set. If we don't like what we see, then we go back to feature engineering and rerun the models. Then once we get appropriate results, we save the models for future generations. So we chose random forest because random forest, we found that it was really good for a large number of categorical data, and it was a lot more flexible in accepting the user input that you wanted to pass in. The features that we passed into the random forest model in the previous iteration were the foundation of music foundational features, such as key signatures, key mode, note duration, and whatnot. There were also features, very lyric-based features. That's where Elysia makes the connection between lyrics and music. So we had syllable type, word frequency, word variety. For this iteration of Elysia, we've also added a lot of musical features, such as this last note. It kind of trying to have the system learn how to properly end phrases. A step difference, which can also be called intervals, because we wanted to for the system to learn how far the music travel. That came really handy, especially since we added the octave model. Instead of outputting generation in 1 octave range to 4 octave range, now Elysia can give very wide variety of moving pieces, moving phrases, I should say. So that's the metrics, the accuracy that we've got for the different models. So the octave models perform accuracy-wise much better than the other models. That's because there's a lot less classes to choose from. So the baseline is already very high. As you know, pop songs are mostly in the 4th and 5th octave range, so they don't go really high or really low. So there's a lot more tempo of those. And the melody model is the weakest. There's a lot more classes, so every person will know from the chromatic point of view. And yeah. So for this version also, we added a couple of co-created functionality. The first one is a kid melody and change the rhythm, and the second one is how to make make phrases that are similar to a previous select phrase. So the first functionality, kid melody, change rhythm, goes like this. Let's say that the user generates a certain number of phrases and really likes the pitches of one of them, but things that the groove isn't quite right. So the rhythm pattern is a little bit off. So it can send it back to Elysia, and Elysia would then generate n number of melodies with the exact same pitches, but with different rhythm. So that the user can really see what's out there with different rhythm patterns. The similarity co-created functionality is there for the user to, if they like a certain phrase, then they can generate n number of phrases that are quite similar to the one that they like. So we think that those are quite important because it allows the user to explore the space and also see what could be. Now, being a system that can also generate hundreds of different phrases, it can be quite annoying to go through all of them and try to find the one that you like. So to help with that, Alicia ranks, assigns scores for every phrase that she generates and ranks them in that order. So for that formula, we kind of had a playful talk and pull between likelihood and entropy. So likelihood is calculated by pretty much using the probability of the random forest model. So each node has a probability of, each skill degree, I should say, has a probability of being the next pitch. So we use that probability, multiply them together, that's how we get the likelihood. Now, pop music has a lot of repeated patterns and repeated notes. So the probability of the next note being the same as the previous note is quite likely. So in order to counteract that, we came up with entropy, which is how diverse the scale degrees are. So we penalize repeated sequence. So if you have the same note repeated at one after the other, that gets penalized a lot more than if you have a little bit more variation in the phrases. The other negation, it takes into account the length of the phrases and also make sure that it returns a probability between 0 and 1.
All right. Thank you, Chris. Okay, so now we'll tell you how we use the system. This is a picture of Emily Dickinson, and there's been lots of human composers who chose her poetry to set to music. So we thought, why not Alicia? Let's see what she can come up with. So for this particular song, we had a classically trained musician, a music professor, Joshua Palki, use Alicia by himself to come up with a melody, which he later added piano accompaniments to. So this is one of the songs that I'm going to sing in the concert. I'm not going to play the whole thing, but I'll play about a minute of it to give you an idea. Just as again, I just want to get a beat underneath. All right, so I'll sing this one, a couple more songs, maybe so we can apply in the concert. Okay, so another, oh, now you can really hear me. So one of the things that we wanted to do also with this paper is to understand the utility of our system for a classical musician. So I'm actually going to read what Joshua wrote based on his experience with Alicia. All right, I very much enjoyed composing with Alicia. When I started working on Hope the Thing with Feathers, a setting of an Emily Dickinson poem, it was difficult to begin. You see, he's honest. It was my first time working with Alicia or anything like it, and my first time working on an arrangement phrase by phrase. Having the computer generate melodies was exciting for me as a musician who identifies much more as an arranger than a composer. I'm also a choral conductor and singer, so I worked to find melodies that honored the text and also sounded pleasant or interesting. The advantage of working with Alicia was that I got to think harmonically, which is much more along the lines of how I think as a composer-arranger. I worked to connect the harmonic tissue of the piece to support and enhance Alicia's melodies. Coming up with a melody was an incredibly difficult thing for me and for many composers, adventure. Having Alicia provide the melodies allowed me to experience the compositional process in a new way. It has made me think that I may work very well with a collaborator, human or computer, on future projects. This was actually news for us. I wasn't sure if what we were building was only useful for somebody like me who cannot write songs at all, who's not a composer, has no training, or whether it has some utility for professionals. Now Now, this is not included on the slides, but whenever we do show the system to a person who likes to write melodies, typically the feedback isn't quite this enthusiastic. That's the part that they want to do themselves. But here we have a professional composer who likes to focus on other parts of the composition process. And it was valuable for us to learn that we're actually providing some value to the system, even in that professional setting. Do I have time for another one? I'm flexible about it. Anybody keeping track of time?
Yeah, you got 3 minutes.
Oh, no, it's not good time. Okay, here's another song that actually didn't make it to the concert because, yeah, pick and choose. There's finite time. Okay, this one I made myself, which is important because I can't write songs for that system. So I'll play it. And it's also an ridiculously fun.
We got a few minutes for comments and questions.
This might be my notes because I missed the earlier talk. Is it setting melodies and setting the words to melodies, or is that a later stage where you put melodies?
Yeah, so it's given the word about a sentence at a time, and it's coming up with melodies specifically for it.
The composer was looking where did you restrict them to not change a note or duration?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So how much do we let the composer make changes? And the temptation to make changes is quite strong, especially for composers. So we actually told him to change whatever he likes, so that we can see how much he's naturally inclined to change. With this, so these two songs are actually made using slightly different versions of the system and the iterative design process. So for the first one, he made primarily his changes were for the final note. I think a few times, I think there were maybe 2 or 3 rhythms he had to change throughout. Again, the final notes were problematic because the phrases wouldn't naturally end, and this is exactly why we added some new features. So we now have a feature that tells the system when it's the end of a phrase. And so so for this final version, I think I changed 1 note for this most recent one. So minimal change. Yes, this is Frank. But tonight at the concert, you'll hear a version of Frank on Italian tuning art.
The poetry in Italy is quite an odd, neater, irregular. It's very different and much more rich than the typical lyrics you have in the pop music. Did you try comparing the models between those 2 kinds of texts?
Okay, so we didn't train on her music, right? We just used the system on her lyrics at the end. It would be interesting to perhaps compare the results on this type of poetry versus simpler meter poetry. But we have to think about it. That's an interesting idea. We did run the system on other types of poems, and one of the songs we're going to do tonight, the lyrics come from an automated system called Mabel. My student did that. Yeah, that's an interesting point.
So I have a question too. In computer-assisted composition, what I find myself, so we have this system called the Style Machine that we developed with Arnie, and I make house music with it. We're releasing a vinyl soon. And what I find myself doing is a lot of curation. I'm like, okay, this is nice composition, change the baseline. No, not this baseline. No, not this one. Oh, this one. I can work with. And is there a lot of creation in this case? Like, if you find yourself trying it out and running Alisa many times before you're like, okay, that's it?
So that's been dropping a little bit, of course. In the beginning, the first versions, it took a long time to find anything usable. And we do it at 7% at a time. So it's not that we got the whole score and then we changed 2 notes and we're done. For each melody line, we select between the first. Well, actually, this would take a long time partially because the system itself did not have a preference. So it didn't sort them. Now that Alicia has this, what Chris showed you, it has a way of evaluating how good each melody is. It's actually pretty good at doing this evaluation. So it puts the best melodies on top. So you can usually find something good within the first 5-ish.
And to answer your question, there's also we also have a parameter called the export method parameter. So what it does is that if that number is really high, then the user would be heavily relying on the model's suggestion. So that parameter, some of the composers that we work on, likes it to be a little bit somewhere in the middle rather than extremely heavy. And so that, what you were talking about, the bias thing on your system, would be, I guess, comparable to that. So
I think even so, I can with Explorer, it's like we still,
yeah,
we still curate, we still select between the melodies and we still combine them together. So, but that's right. It's not interesting, but what Chris is bringing up, that when Josh used our system, he wanted the system to rely less on the model. He liked it when it was kind of more wild and experimental. News for it.
So this is kind of a more technical question. So for one sentence, you're feeding all of the features of that sentence into the random forest all at once, right? One giant vector, right?
Right.
no. So for when we press in the lyrics, for each word, we I can explain it.
I think there's a training. Training.
Okay, so the training part does like that. So we, from the music XML file, we grab each note. From each note, we extract all the features, different features from that note. And from the lyrics, we extract certain features, so word variety and word frequency. And using that, we pass that to the model. And yeah, it's supervised. So once it does supervised learning, and for the next step of testing, it predicts one of the classes. Does that help?
Yeah. Well, so that was leading up to my next question, which is how many, like, how big is the vector? Like, what dimensional?
Oh, how big is the feature vector? Yeah,
Like,
it can M100. It's I think it was couple hundred. Yeah. Pretty much.
But you also have, a lot of data. We don't train on one sentence. We train on a whole bunch of songs. I mean, for this, it wasn't so huge, 30 songs, actually.
Yeah.
But then right now, we finally got a database with hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands. But anyway, the mammoth data set. And so they're having a lot of features. Doesn't hurt anymore. It's much smaller than the data size. One question.
One quick question when we switch speaker. If not, that's a good reminder to come to the concert. Thank you. Next is a paper co-authored by Paul Parasal and Arnie Engelfeld. And we're in the session on metacomposition. So Paul is going to talk about his system, the generative music system that is. We were talking earlier on this continuum between artistic work and generative systems that have a strong aesthetic signature versus systems that are more generic, like the style machine or the flow machine, and style imitation systems. And that certainly does sit on this end of the spectrum that is more of artistic nature.
Okay, so today I'm going to talk to you guys about a piece of generative music software I built. It's called Provide. And Provide is a program designed to create a complete and unique piece of music in real time every time it's run. And one of the main features of the program is that it does this with no input from the listener. So when you open the program up, you basically get a start button, some very basic audio controls, an option to record the run or not, and a bit of display. And the motivation for distributing and presenting the piece like this was that I wanted to create something that would keep the listening experience more or less the same as it would be with any other piece of downloaded music. So you kind of just get this file, press play, and listen to whatever comes out. But at the same time, I wanted to take advantage of computer computer's ability to actively shape and create these things we experience instead of just playing them back. So it's purposely a bit of a black box, and it doesn't really give you any way of knowing what it is, what it's doing, or how it's generating, which is basically what the rest of this presentation will hopefully clarify. So in terms of what actually happens when you press start, I think the best way to understand Torbay is as a program which generates and insonifies a structure. And the four major components of this structure for any given piece are a gesture, phrases, events, and sections. And just to give a brief overview of how these things relate to one another, a gesture is a series of phrases, events occur within phrases, and each phrase progresses independently through a series of four sections. So the basic trajectory of any given piece generated by Torbay can pretty much be understood as the progression of each phrase in the gesture through these sections. And a good amount of this presentation will basically be a description of what happens in each of these four sections. But first, there's a bit that needs to be clarified about these structural units. So the first unit I'll describe is the gesture. And once you press start, Torbay begins randomly selecting millisecond values between 50 and 12,000 milliseconds. And the reason I decided on this range of values is because any two sounds need at least 50 milliseconds between them to be heard as separate. And 12 seconds is the length of a double whole note at the slowest standard metronome marking of quarter note equals 40. To decide when to stop selecting values, the computer compares each newly selected value to whatever trend starts to emerge in preceding values. So the basic idea is that the program tries to recognize when a trend has emerged and whether or not a new value contradicts or conforms to that trend enough to be considered a part of the gesture. So for example, if values have been very similar and the most recently generated value is super different from all the values that came before, then this new value is less likely to be considered a part of the gesture. And in the case that the program decides that it's not a part of the gesture, that value is discarded and generation stops. So on the other hand, if values have been very different, then gesture generation is more likely to stop the more similar a new value is to preceding values. So once generation stops, each millisecond value is used as the duration of a single phrase, and this series of phrases is referred to as gesture. It's also important to note now that phrases are presented sequentially within a gesture, which is just to say that they aren't all occurring simultaneously. Also, since phrases and gestures are used primarily as temporal structures within Torbay, neither of them are ever really heard. So in terms of the actual audio content, there are events which occur within phrases. And an event serves essentially the same function as a note in traditional musical notation in that it contains information about how to generate any given sound you hear in a run of Torbay. However, whereas the parameters of a traditional note in modern staff notation are always pitch and duration, the parameters contained in an event are determined by the last remaining structural unit, sections. So where phrases and gestures provide temporal structures and events serve as containers for sound generating parameter values, sections determine what those parameters are and can be understood as determining the temporal trajectory of the piece. So the basic way that any given piece generated by Torbay moves forward in time is that once a gesture is generated, the phrases of that gesture are presented sequentially, and events generated within a given phrase contain sound generating parameters determined by whichever section the phrase is currently in. Additionally, every time a phrase ends, a test specific to the current section of the phrase is run to determine whether or not the phrase will progress to the next section. And each repetition of the section is referred to as the cycle. Finally, when the last phrase in the gesture ends, the gesture starts over from the first phrase. And this process repeats until any phrase meets the condition for ending the fourth section. So now that I've described the larger structural scaffolding of a piece that's generated by Torbay, I'll fill in the details about what specifically is generated and heard in each section, starting with section 1. So in section 1, temporal subdivisions of each phrase are articulated with clicks. And the way this happens is that once all the durations of the phrases in a gesture have been generated, Torbay calculates a set of ratios by dividing each phrase duration by the total gesture duration. So as an example, say we have a gesture with 3 phrases A, B, and C with lengths of 4.5 seconds, 5 seconds, and a half second respectively. In this case, the gesture length would be 10 seconds, and each phrase would yield ratios of 0.45, 0.5, and 0.05. Now, once all these values have been calculated, all possible combinations of these ratios are calculated and stored. And in the case of our example, the possible combinations of 0.45, 0.5, and 0.05 would be the original set of ratios, ratio A and the sum of B and C, ratio B and the sum of A and C, ratio C and the sum of A and B, and the sum of all 3 ratios. So once all of these ratios and possible combinations have been calculated and stored, each time a phrase begins its first cycle of section 1, its duration is subdivided by a random selection from the list of possible combinations. And with each subsequent cycle of section 1, the subdivisions of the previous cycle are further subdivided using the same method of random selection. So Using the ratio combination from previous examples, we have a phrase, here we have a phrase that has completed 3 cycles of section 1. And in the first cycle, it was divided in 2. In the second cycle, each subdivision from the first cycle was again divided in 2, but by different sets of ratios. And finally, in the third cycle, the 4 subdivisions of the second cycle were divided into 2, 1, 2, and 3 parts respectively. And as I mentioned earlier, each of these subdivisions are articulated by clicks, so this whole subdivision process ends up sounding like this. And just to fill in a couple last details about these clicks, at every subdivision of the phrase, a click is assigned a random amplitude value between 1 and -1, and randomly sent to either the left or the right channel. A final thing that's important to know about section 1 is that each click you hear is also stored in a wave table as a single sample, and the length of this wave table in samples corresponds to the length in milliseconds of the current phrase, while the position of a sample in the table corresponds to the time at which the click occurred within the phrase. Finally, a new wave table is generated and stored with each cycle of the phrase. So in this example, a single phrase has been through 8 cycles and generated 8 wave tables. And as we can see, as each cycle subdivides the subdivisions of the previous cycle, the wave tables become more and more populated with samples corresponding to the increasing number of clicks heard in the phrase. So finally, as mentioned earlier, each section has its own specific conditions for ending, and the way that a phrase in section 1 determines whether or not it will move on to section 2 is based on how many of its clicks occur within less than 50 milliseconds of one another. So at the end of the cycle of a phrase in section 1, the number of subdivisions shorter than 50 milliseconds are counted, and this number is divided by the total number of subdivisions in that phrase, and then this ratio is used as the probability that the phrase will progress to the next section, which means that as a phrase in section 1 continues to subdivide itself, the time between any 2 clicks in that phrase gets shorter and shorter, causing this ratio to get larger and make the phrase more and more likely to progress to section 2. So where in section 1, events were made audible with clicks, in section 2, events are based on wave table synthesis of data from section 1. And each event in section 2 has 3 main parameters, which are duration, frequency, and waveform. And to quickly explain how the value of each of these parameters is generated, for duration, ratios from section 1 are multiplied by the length of the phrase to determine the event's length in milliseconds. And which specific ratio is used is based on how many times each ratio occurred while the phrase was still in section 1. So using our subdivision example from earlier, the table on the left, your right, shows the probabilities of each ratio being selected based on how many times it was used to subdivide the phrase in section 1. Frequency also uses section 1 ratios and selects them in the same way as is done for duration, but then operates on whichever ratio it selects a bit differently in order to produce a rate in hertz at which to read through one of the wave tables stored in section 1. And finally, the waveform of an event is a waveform of an event in section 2 is determined by randomly selecting one of the wave tables stored for whichever phrase the event is occurring in. So it's also important to note at this point that unlike the first section, in which a click is heard for each event, not every event in section 2 is sonified. Instead, for each phrase in section 2, a density value is calculated by dividing how many times the phrase was subdivided in section 1 by how many times it could have possibly been subdivided. And the denominator in this case is calculated as the number of phrases in the gesture raised by the number of cycles achieved by the phrase. And all of this ends up sounding like this. In terms of ending section 2, the decision for a phrase to move on to section 3 is made based on a calculation of values which I refer to as similarity and identity. And unfortunately, there isn't quite enough time to explain exactly how these values are calculated, but as a quick and hopefully sufficient overview, similarity is calculated based on the parameter values of events in section 2, and is constantly updated and stored for phrases within which section 2 events are occurring. Additionally, whether or not a given event is stored for a phrase in section 2 is based on a comparison of its similarity to the previously stored event. And the idea here is that if events in a phrase in section 2 have been highly dissimilar, then subsequent events are more likely to be stored the more dissimilar they are to preceding events. While if events in a phrase in section 2 have been highly similar, then subsequent events are more likely to be stored the more similar they are to preceding events. Identity, on the other hand, measures the convergence of stored similarity values for a given phrase. So whenever a new event is stored, the identity of the phrase for which that event has been stored is calculated as the absolute value of the difference between the mean of similarity values before and after the most recent storage event So basically, the absolute value of the difference between the average similarity of a phrase before the most recent event storage and the average similarity of that same phrase after the most recent event storage. The probability of the phrase progressing to section 3 is then calculated as 1 minus the phrase's identity value, since a smaller identity value means the event similarity averages have been converging. So moving on to section 3, events in a phrase in section 3 contain the same parameters as in section 2 and generate audio using the same wavetable synthesis technique, but the value of each parameter in a given event is selected from values stored in section 2 based on the similarity value corresponding to each stored parameter value. So for every event in section 3, the similarity values of each parameter value stored in section 2 are compared to the average similarity of the given parameter. And the smaller the difference between these two values is for a given parameter value, the more likely that that parameter value will be selected for an event. So basically, a given parameter value is more likely to be selected if its similarity value is closer to the average similarity of all values for that parameter. Aside from this new method for generating parameter values, the major distinguishing feature of section 3 is that events are put through 3 rounds of spectral analysis. And you can read more about what these are in the paper, but basically what the analysis tries to do is identify the strongest frequency content of a given event, and then create a series of bandpass filters which emphasize these frequencies. So as these new techniques for parameter selection begin to generate enough events for these filters to really start to take shape, section 3 tends to sound like this. So it sounds pretty similar to the second section, but you can hear some of the noise getting a bit more resonant. Finally, once any given event in a phrase has been through all 3 rounds of spectral analysis, a new event type is introduced for that phrase, and this new event type is called click 2. And the audio for this event type, which is played concurrently with the output of the wavetable synthesizer, is comprised of clicks filtered based on 3rd round spectral analysis data. Additionally, click 2 onsets are determined in the same way as event onsets for the wavetable synthesizer, albeit independently. And these new events then sound like this. In terms of ending section 3, the decision of whether or not a phrase will move on to section 4 is based on how many wavetable synthesizer events have been through all 3 rounds of spectral analysis. So pretty simply, the more events that have been through all 3 rounds of spectral analysis, the more likely the phrase associated with those events is to move on to section 4. So for starters, in section 4, the wavetable synthesizer and click 2 event types are heard in section, the wavetable synthesizer and click 2 event types heard in section 3 continue to use stored parameter values in round 3 spectral analysis data to generate audio. But section 4 also introduces 4 new event types, which are sign, countersend, counterclick, and countersign. So to start with the first of these 4 new event types. When signs are introduced, the first thing they do is track the spectral centroid at the output of the wavetable synthesizer and clock the total amount of time that any given frequency is identified as the centroid. And here is an example. We have a 1300 millisecond event in which 1235, 350, and 975 hertz were found to be the spectral centroid for 350, 250, and 700 milliseconds respectively. And once each centroid has been tracked and clocked, the duration of each frequency is divided by the total event duration to determine what I refer to as frequency limit. So in the same example, the 3 frequencies are assigned ratios of 0.27, 0.19, and 0.54. And when a signed event starts, it generates its own unique duration based on data stored in previous sections and multiplies this duration by each of the 3 frequency rhythm ratios to determine the duration of each frequency within the event. So using the frequencies and ratios of the previous example for a 2000 millisecond signs event, sign tones tuned to 1235, 250, and 975 hertz will be heard for 540, 380, and 1080 milliseconds respectively. But since values of less than the total duration of the event, each tone does not necessarily need to start at the beginning of the event. So the onset of each tone is determined by randomly selecting a value that is less than or equal to the difference between the length of the event and the length of a given tone. So continuing with this example, the 1235 hertz sign tone can start as late as 1460 milliseconds into the event, while the 350 and 975 hertz tones can start as late as 1620 and 920 So now that science has been described, we can move on to look at the remaining 3 new event types added in section 4, which to recap are counter-SYN, counter-click, and counter-sign. And what's important to know about these new events is that whereas all events before them generated parameter values by organizing, recognizing, and accentuating terms in random sources, counter events use similarity values stored over the course of a given piece to adjust existing data and create entirely new parameter values. And there's not quite enough time to obviously describe all these operations, but I can give a brief overview of what data is being adjusted for each new event, starting with the counter-SYN, which uses adjusted duration and round-3 spectral analysis data to determine the length and timbre of filtered white noise, while counter-click adjusts the same parameter types as counter-SYN in order to determine onset positions and frequency content of filtered clicks. And finally, counter-sign adjusts frequency rhythm values to determine the onset position, duration, and tunings of individual sine tones. So the important thing here to remember, or sort of like take away, is that counter events mark something of a departure from the generative techniques of the program up to this point, insofar as they look at existing data, they look at existing data to create completely new data instead of trying to recognize and emphasize trends in random sources. And with these new counter events now playing alongside signs, click2, and the original wavetable synthesizer, section 4 usually sounds like this. So finally, to end section 4, and also the piece, every time a phrase completes the cycle in section 4, the parameter values of that and all preceding events are checked to see how many identical parameter values have already been stored. And the more identical values are found, the higher the probability the piece will end. And that pretty much wraps up the description of what happens in each of these 4 sections. So just to give a quick overview of everything that we've covered, here's a diagram of how data moves through any given piece generated by Provide. And hopefully what you can see here is that all data generated with a piece has a basis in some kind of earlier data. So the length of the phrase in the initial gesture determine a set of ratios in section 1, which are then used to determine density, durations, frequency, and waveforms of events generated in section 2. Then in section 3, these events are put through 3 rounds of spectral analysis, which inform frequency, durations, and counter events. And what's I think most important to note here is that everything can ultimately be traced back to the initial gesture, which basically is to say that individual runs of Provide can be understood as a series of variations generated from increasingly extended derivations of the initial gesture. In terms of how audible these derivations actually are, I'd be lying if I said I could hear the relationship between something like the temporal spacing of clicks in section 1 and the timbral structure of events in section 4. So in general, the relationships of and continuities between specific pieces of data are, for me at least, impossible to hear. But because of the reinforcements of trends, trends via probability tables and continual grouping of parameters throughout the piece, recognizable timbral and temporal structures do begin to emerge within phrases. Additionally, a given phrase can often eventually be identified by its level of activity. And because each section is associated with fairly distinct synthesis techniques, their timbral quality tends to clarify the overall trajectory of a given piece, as well as the generative structures of the program as a whole. So while connections between individual parameters tend to escape my ears, a given piece usually ends up having enough continuity and similarity that I can hear some amount of self-organization on the part of the program. And
Thank you. We're right on time, and I think we have just more for the time for questions and comments. I have one maybe to start it because it was a very technical and lengthy presentation of the piece. So with the musical metacreation, as in the rest of computational creativity, there is modeling creativity as it is. You're also exploring creativity as it could be. And so I want to hear from you as a composer, what are your intentions behind your heuristic choice, and definitely a process that in that case is certainly very inhuman. You know, this is not something that you would want to do by hand, by any means. And so that's the first part of my question. And the second part is what I find interesting here is this a sort of continuum between usually composition and interpretation are fairly distinct, and even sometimes you have composition and interpretation and then sound generation itself. And it seems that here there's moments where the composition is about form, but at some other times it directly generates the sound substrate of the piece. So that's my two questions. But first, let's hear about your intentions and motivations behind this process.
Yeah, so I think the basic idea that this was a graduating project, and the initial sort of impetus for that project at Unfraser was that I would make software in this way, that I would make music in this way as little pieces of software. Kind of when I started out, I sort of like with some of these higher level structures like notes and harmony, there was so much sort of overhead in making that. So I kind of tried to strip things back and as much as I could until I was sort of dealing with these very basic units, like it just writes samples and reads through the samples really fast and then kind of looks at itself over and over again. And I think sort of the basic creative, I guess like the creative identity of this was similarly sort of like breaking down what my understanding of my creative process is, which is that, I find some kind of material that I think is compelling and I present it for, some amount of time, a piece, and then something different has to happen. But, or at least that's my opinion, that there has to be some kind of progression or change or something like that. And so usually, in my process at least, that tends to involve kind of like looking back at what I did and saying, how can I make something that's either, it's crazy different or fairly similar but noticeably different, so keep that some sort of trajectory or kind of lifespan or whatever direction. So what I tried to give the system really was this ability to, everything sort of starts out random, but I tried to give it the ability to look back at these random things and as much as possible understand the trends that were in them so that it could then sort of make more and more structured decisions about whether it wanted to strongly contrast itself or be really similar to itself or anything like that. So yeah, I think that was sort of like my motivation was sort of like from this place of just kind of wanting to strip away all these different layers and sort of get to the bottom of what I understood my creative process to be. And in that sense, it was really just an experiment. Like at a certain point when I decided I was just going to use samples and all these really basic things, I was just like, well, I just kind of commit to it and see what it sounds like. So yeah, I'd say that was something pretty cool.
The second one is about whether it's meta composition or meta sound synthesis, like this distinction between composition and interpretation.
I might need to verify.
Well, it seems that some of you, for example, in the first section, the composition, I mean, the only sound is the click, and the composition is just a sequence of clicks. So
yeah.
Here, composition and interpretation and sound synthesis are those three things at the same time.
Right. So I guess a big what ended up sort of being one of the big features of this, I guess what I sort of alluded to it in one of the first slides, is that it's really an easy way to understand this system is as something that sonifies its own structure. And so the beginning parts are just like when I was sort of making all of these structural decisions or designing all these things that would structure the piece in time, I decided to just make that audible. So it sort of moves, and also because those clicks and those time structures, the time structures in the beginning, those sort of ratios between all these clicks, they end up sort of filtering down to every part of the piece. So that at the end, sort of these very basic time structures have been extended out into everything you hear. And so it was important to me, I think, to hear those in the beginning. So that's where things are sort of very direct in that moment, is that you just literally hear kind of these very large temporal structures that it's creating. And then as time goes on, it starts to move further and further away from that, and its decisions are sort of divorced or further, more distant from what you're actually hearing.
I'm interested in the actual process of making this work. Is it real time? Does it render itself out over time? How does that unfold?
Yeah, so you like download this window. It's available for download online, and you just kind of you get this. This is the max patch and you press start, and it generates until it's done. So it is real time, and I guess as a reference for that, like pieces can be pieces in as short as 50 seconds and as long as 40 minutes. So yeah, press start and it does it.
And Sami,
have you tried out experimenting with actually using specific samples? We're using like one-shot samples from like various type of instruments. I'm not sure if it's directly possible to do it, but it's something that you is really interesting.
Yeah, that's kind of where the project started, and just kind of like more and more out of sort of like frustration with working in that way, and also you know, when you're working with samples and some of that more detailed audio, obviously like things like mixing and mastering and like effects become these additional structures that you have to program. So that was kind of where it started, and then I just felt that I needed to strip it back for this sort of first proof of concept.
Two observations and a quick question. You can comment on it. So I just try to explain this to myself, just in my own internal dialogue. It seems that one description is it's really dedicated to the idea of causality, which is odd because there's a huge number of uncontrolled random decisions, but it has this kind of persistence about it, this idea of sonifying itself, and that you may or may not agree with. The other one is that it has this feeling of autopoiesis, which is also this notion of sonifying itself. So if that's a term you're not familiar with, you can look into autopoiesis, which is a cybernetic term. Okay. Those two things lead me to ask you a question. Does the fourth section have to come at the end?
I think so. I think it does. Just because, I think actually the real answer to the question is that it could just jump straight to the fourth section and then maybe work itself back. So no, but just by the way that I designed it, it sort of has to wait for all these things to happen. So
And do we have to hear them in that order?
with this iteration of the program, yes. But obviously,
That's a composition question.
Yeah, yeah. I think just again for this sort of like step through proof of concept of being very clear about what the compositional structure was, that was how I decided to do it for this piece. But programming wise, it's very possible I think to do it in any direction.
Thank you.
all right, let's take a speaker again.
Thank you.
Next, we have a paper quoted by Samuel DSC and Richard Cohen about Samuel is a composer himself and solving adaptive game music transitions from a composer-centered perspective.
Yeah, that's working with this level. Yes, sir. Good afternoon or good morning if it's still Australian time, like that. So we're talking about, sorry, I forgot my microphone. So we're talking about solving adaptive music video games from a composer-centered perspective. So as we kind of discussed briefly, there's kind of a lot of algorithmic approaches towards stylistic imitation. And in this case, we're looking more from a perspective of how composers can potentially either curate those algorithms directly or really have control of the style. That's the kind of end goal of the ideal of this. But otherwise, let's get into what adaptive music looks like in video games. So adaptive music is the time when the player goes to the combat, and we need to change that. Change up the style, change up the mode, let the player have something that fits with them. We understand that intuitively. So it also though can relate to other aspects of the game, such as trying to communicate ideas of the players in danger. Perhaps we should increase the intensity of the music, try and support that level of the danger they're in. Or as other writers have also
suggested, there is also room for augmenting the user experience. So, for example, if it's a stealth game and you're trying to sneak up on somebody, changing the score as somebody becomes more alert can help communicate ideas to this player. For this particular research that will be presented today, we're primarily looking at transitions as their very kind of key, key kind of defined section. So we'll be focusing on that, but to be aware that the idea of adaptive music does expand beyond strictly transitions. So currently, the general approaches towards this revolve around layering audio. So that's the case of players in players in danger, we can add more tracks. This technique is used in other kind of aspects of writing game music, but it is an important part of adaptive music. Otherwise, transition segments is the concept where we've got a track of audio going along, we tag a point in that audio, and say at this point we transition to another track of audio, which will then kind of act as the segue, the bridging section to go to our next, the next piece, which once again, then we have the cue points, okay, we're going to transition here. Then crossfading is also relatively common. So it's, I think you're lowering volume on one track, raising it on the other. Some games overlap segments during this. Some games prefer to keep it simpler and just completely drop out of the track or bring in the next one. Otherwise, occasionally you do end up with generative processes being used. Typically, these have been, so I guess in the past kind of 10 years or so, these have been predominantly audio-based, as that's been that's been the tools that have been available through software packages such as Wise or F1. Prior to that, before when computers had built-in synthesizers or like Nintendo, there were many base systems. iMuse was particularly famous for it. And so in this case, these are some great ideas, and it'd be really useful to be able to incorporate more of these generative ideas. So as for this research, our methodology has been looking at, I myself, composing just some very simple scores to some recorded gameplay, and then moving from that to then analyze in a self-reflective kind of process, practice-led process, the techniques, like the core techniques that we use in that situation, all those transitions. And then moving from that into kind of an implementation, and then from that implementation as a generative system to a comparison back to the analysis. And so this has kind of come through this first kind of iteration of this cycle, so that's what we're looking at. So from here, again, so let's have a look at one of the self-composed sections. This is transition from just kind of cruising around the galaxy. This game that we're looking at is called Rebel Galaxy. It's made by Double Damage Games, released in 2015. And otherwise, then we're going to transition to combat. So this is the human composed piece. So from this, we can hear some general techniques that have been used here. So we started off obviously with lower tempo. We had kind of different tonal center, probably we had a different tonal structure as well, different mode being used. And then, as in taking the kind of sitting here and looking at the recording of this, the kind of natural idea is, okay, we want to have a nice smooth transition here, so we start trying to anticipate what's coming. So we can hear, you might have heard the kind of Accelerando, there was transition, some instruments dropped out, others came in, and so this establishes a very kind of clear change in the structure. We can hear we've changed to combat. It's more fitting than just continuing on with the music that's going on before. And so, yeah, the relatively smooth transition, certainly more connected than a crossfade, which is what is normally used in this particular game. They use crossfades, as is relatively common in kind of open world games. And now let's have a look at another one. So this is another human composed example, this time going out of combat into more peaceful kind of space. So coming out of this one, we can hear similar approaches here, but a change in character from the kind of more frenetic pace of the previous section, coming down to less defined kind of tempo, rhythmic space, and once again kind of changing the pitch structure. And so we move one direction, we kind of just come back, and from here. Let's have a look at kind of some of the, I guess, key features then that we're looking at for the implementation. So as we said, this change in tempo is important. We've got to be able to change, keep that definition, so keep that structure clear. Tonality is once again clearly being used in that section, so we need to be able to change tonality very rapidly, but also smoothly as best we can. And we need to have instrumentation so we can be able to change that, and we also need to be able to think about the characters. So it's kind of long drawn out notes, a little more kind of staccato kind of character. So tackling concepts of tonality and tempo, rhythm, kind of end up heading more towards end up arriving at an idea of intervallic spaces. So this kind of plays off, I guess, some of the stuff we were talking about before, like the too much geometry of music, that sort of space, and also being informed by, I guess, some of the early writing in that space, like Lewin, Lewin, I think it is. And so the idea here is that we can define. For example, we can look at the interval vector, and we can take that interval vector, and we can consider that, okay, cool, we can consider the space. From this, we can work out from this how to map abstract values into the space. The interval vector becomes, I guess, in semantic terms, like a measure. So we can map onto that space. So here, for example, say if we're looking in kind of like a scale context, say we had a kind of emotive kind of pattern, the movement that we're using. This mapping kind of 0, 1, 3, 2, pretty straightforward. If say we're throwing this into kind of an octatonic space, then we end up we're assuming a 12-tone kind of foundation for this. Then we end up with 0, 2, 5, 3, pentatonic 0, 2, 7, 5. And so you can kind of see slightly more in the graph of that there. So this is relatively useful because it means we can apply into like the same kind of concepts for tempo or like rhythms, although obviously wouldn't necessarily have the same spaces, but the same arithmetic works for rhythms as it does for scales and metallic spaces. And additionally, we can then start layering these up. So for example, we could have interval vector for a chord, which we can then map onto an interval vector for scales, which we could then map onto an interval vector, which makes it meaningful for like MIDI or like a piano keyboard. So we can start creating hierarchies of these spaces. And these hierarchies then also start giving us the flexibility to be able to swap out particular sections particular vectors as you move through, so that we can, for example, have, once again, like individual kind of core pattern, but we can flip out the foundation underneath that very quickly, very easily. And otherwise, we also, in this process, bundled a couple of additional bits of information with the vector. So, for example, what interval does this expand at? So, for example, say we had a triad that we're interested in looking at it in, I guess, your kind of classic, we've got a line there, configuration. In that case, we just want to keep expanding with the intervals that are there. But for example, say we wanted to keep this triad, then we want to expand the 12th, the octave. And so keeping this information allows us to kind of play with some of these structures a little bit more, and also allows us to then look at non-octavating or more complex like tonal structures. And so moving on from this though, it's all well and good to have the structure. We need a way to define phrase length structure. Okay. And so in this case, we ended up keeping a very simple system using Bezier curves to just simply map, okay, the phrase has this kind of shape to it. And so from that point, from those points of having this kind of curve laid out, we then use a kind of appropriated species counterpoint system to more or less search for fitting pitches in that space. So this allows us to start with a curve and then map kind of meaningful pitch content onto it. So we've actually fixed the register and fixed the contour. From this point, then we can start selecting, we can start fitting more complex sonorities, chords and the likes. So from this stage, we have spaces over one side, as one kind of information, so pitch spaces, rhythm spaces. Then we have the selection section, and so for example, we can define the intervals that the counterpoint is using. Then we have the chord sets, which is where we are then fitting these chord sets as they would work with the harmony that's been structured from the phrase curves and the intervals. And then from there, we can start, once we have this harmonic structure, we can start fitting in motifs and think about instrumentation. So to get this all working and kind of see how this would work, we took gameplay footage, annotated it with this kind of happens this frame. So keeping it very simple, as simple as you could easily find in just any game, and then throwing this through the kind of generative system and mixing the game audio back in after we've generated the audio. Might come back to the question. So just skip the next slide. And so let's start having a look now at the results of the generative system. So I might just figure out the time, please. So briefly, kind of from this, we had a very kind of brief set of transition, and so the instrumentation changes. We can hear that, and that was working. Although in this case, this is very much a placeholder, like hard-coded changes there. Tonality does change relatively effectively, and the voice leading works resolves relatively well between it, which keeps the flow. And the tempo, once again, completely changes. Character, changes, works pretty well with, once again, kind of a combination of the gestures, the motifs you have to that space change. bridging passage is gone because this is operating in real time, and there's no, in this particular system, there's no anticipation. So the best that the system does is use parameters to, parametric alteration to kind of try and elicit that idea, but it is a much harder change, and that's still something to work on and think about. And maybe game engines in the future will be able to predict a little bit more about what the player's about to do, what that might be useful. So further work from this is looking at different ways for composers to use this system. And so, for example, looking at attaching core generative systems into this kind of core framework that's here would be quite exciting. And also looking at more ways for the system to be able to learn from, like, for example, example scores and things like that that composer writes would be very useful. Otherwise, then developing from this into an interface that a composer can manipulate and use would be, without having to be, I guess, a programming background would be very useful. And obviously integrating into a live game and seeing it work, yeah, in the real thing would be also, I guess, that final kind of test as well. So additionally as well, obviously to require more validation, doing some user studies and surveys would also be quite useful for validating the useful side of things. Yeah, this research has been carried out with sponsorship of the Australian government and also this presentation supported by the USW faculty of art design and Awards Plus network for. Thank you very much.
A few minutes for questions, if you want to that.
Yes. So if the parameters of the system were not learned from the networks, how were they derived?
Yeah. So probably, I guess, curatorial is probably like the best idea. I guess it's kind of like looking at both the compositional side of things and stylistic side of things. So, for example, as a composer, it's kind of, okay, do you want to have a freer kind of drifting scenario which you kind of heard at the start of the generated sample? So in that case, decided we'll go with pentatonic. It's really straightforward and easy to use. And so let's choose a selection of sonorities that I, as a composer, think sound interesting and fit that kind of mood. And so, yeah, really, I guess it's the compositional choice. And in this case, then, I don't necessarily know the order that they're going to occur in. Very much the phrase kind of structure is determining a lot of that. But yeah, so is that necessary?
So it is yeah, heuristic choices. So related questions is how do you think, how generic is that system? And then a follow-up question, very pragmatic one as well is it in Unity or in integrated with game? If it's not integrated to live game, it's integrated to game environment. Unreal or Unity probably. And the third question is how generic you think the system is. You know, this continuum from style imitation being, scientific replication of the style as an unbiased observer without we categorize as being of the style of the corpus versus a particular piece with a definite aesthetic like that of Paul for the
That is a very interesting question. I would say it's the idea with the system is so that it does have a distinct character that a composer can control and set up. So as much as it can be a video game to avoid repetition so that players aren't kind of broken out of the immersion, as much as that's important, at the same time, it's also an important aspect that the soundtrack is reliable, that produces valuable outputs consistently. And so the composer being able to control that and being able to be confident in what kind of outputs come into the system is important. Having to assume an important feature to that. Otherwise, as far as environment, pretty much been, so the gameplay is recorded. There's an Open Brainworks app which I threw together, which can stream the video and stream the OSC messages, and those are picked up by a L6 library which I've been writing. to implement all this as pretty much the prototyping system. And so the plan is, yes, to look at integrating into Unity, so taking all the unit testing for that and starting to develop that in C#, I guess. Yeah.
Because each time I talk to someone from the game industry, there's literally thousands of one-person studio, and each time the generative music is great, do we have it in Unreal or
exactly.
So, any, one more questions where we switch speakers, questions, comments? That's more just a clarification question. So what I understand is when you check what the generative system does,
Yes.
unlike what the title of the paper implies, is that everything but the transitions.
Yes.
Everything.
Yeah, there's very interesting kind of problem trying to solve how to respond as close as possible to real time to that event being triggered. So in the way that it's at the moment is it changes. So it changes the next frame, the next possible kind of phrase that it can. So that's about how fast it can react. So if the action happens right in time for the next kind of rhythmic structural kind of pulse, in that case it will change immediately. Otherwise, it will change parameters, try to signal that there's a change coming.
The only reason you're human composed, you knew it was coming.
Yes.
So you were composed.
But
you couldn't have improvised that.
Exactly. Well, potentially you could, even seeing the game, seeing what's happening. So I hope that in the future, they can become more.
That's why integrating into the game engine is going to be important, because game events will tell you that, and you play that in advance naturally.
Yeah.
Of course, because the game engine knows when the enemy is coming. Let's thank our speaker again. And our last presentation for today is a paper co-authored by Joanna Teixeira and Sofia Pinto. And it's not quite, even if we had a session on metacomposition, it's not quite a composer's perspective. They didn't fit in any of the session really, but it's among those very trendy research that is happening now around cross-modal type of systems. And the title is Cross-Domain Analogy from Image to Music.
Hello, so I'm Joana, and I am from Técnico de Lisboa in Portugal. I just finished my master's degree, so I will be presenting the work I did for my master's thesis, exactly a cross-domain analogy from the visual domain to the musical domain. Sorry. I will talk about some relevant systems that are related to my work, and then I will talk about the two domains that we work in, so the visual and the musical. And then I will explain how we related them to one another and how we implemented the system to generate music from an image given as input. So we seem to think that inspiration and creativity are very closely related, either by being inspired from our inside process and having a eureka moment, or by everything that surrounds us in the world, from artworks, from other people's ideas and artifacts. We are constantly being inspired by everything that surrounds us. So we thought that it would be interesting to see if from an image we could extract the creativity that already exists in it, that was imposed in it from an artist, and try to create an analogy to generate music from it. It is important to understand that we do not consider the system as creative, but as generative. So we use the creativity that already exists in an image and simply transpose it to a different domain. So the first system that inspired our work was proposed by Johnson and Ventura. So it generates musical motions from images and non-musical media using a machine learning model, which is trained in the first phase, and then in the second phase, the user inputs a media file, which is processed, and then the machine learning model will select the best motives. The second system was proposed by Hart, and from an image, it will generate a 3D principal base. The 8 most predominant colors are extracted from an image. its aesthetical profile is created, and using a genetic algorithm, we'll try to create the closest, a base with the closest aesthetical profile. So, from our starting domain, we focus ourselves in color, which surrounds us in the whole world, and we attribute great significance to it, and according to our culture, probably even different interpretations. So, according to color theory, each color has 3 different properties. The hue, which is the name itself. We have the value, which indicates how light or how dark a color is, and finally its intensity, which is the strength and vividness of a color. So we went and extract every single picture, every single pixel from an image, convert it to HSL so that it more closely follows the previous model of color theory. We can create a color histogram to understand the frequency of each color in an image. We try to study the color variation, so how much the color varies throughout an image. For example, in the left image, it gives us a sense of slow-paced movement, while the right image is much more moved. We can categorize the colors into cold or warm colors. And finally, we can also try to create same colored regions, which indicates pixels that are close to each other and represent the same color. In the musical domain, we have many different elements that can be combined in many different ways to create different music. The most basic element, as you all know, are notes, which have a duration, a pitch, an intensity, and a timbre. We also have the rhythm, which is characterized by the number of beats per minute and the time signature. And we also have a genre. There are many different genres, from pop to classical, rock, jazz, electronic, and many others. And the genre will partly define several characteristics of a music. So, it should be important to refer that this project, many decisions were made. It was an experimental project where we tried different approaches, and many constraints, especially a time constraint, which led us to some of these choices. For example, we have this images, which is 730 for 900 pixels. And initially, we were working with smaller images. So, for example, just that tiny portion of the image, which is 300 by 300. And we just started simply by going pixel by pixel, generating a note for each pixel, where each note lasts half a beat. And, well, we ended up with a music with more than 2 hours. And when we actually tried the full-size image, the program just crashed. So we knew that we would have to restrict the size of the generated music, not only to actually be able to create something, but also to facilitate then the evaluation of them. So our first decision was to choose a genre, and we were helped by some musicologists. So we ended up choosing rock, since we could easily, it's relatively simple, and it would help us in certain decisions. So usually it's between 90 and 110 beats per minute, although we worked in the larger intervals, so we could create more varied music. Usually it's in a 4/4 time signature, so all our musics are generated in a 4/4 time signature. Usually they are short songs, smaller than 5 minutes, so this would work with our decision to create short music. There is a restricted number of instruments that are usually used, so guitar, bass, drums, voice, and even sometimes the piano. And there are several layers, so a main melody, which would be a sequence of notes, chord progressions, and a drum track. So, the first analogy that we tried working with was that the number of color variations would give us the number of BPMs. So, as I said, the left image is more slow-paced, while the right is very highly movement. So, a low color variation gives us a slower music, while the latter gives us a faster music. Then, a color can give us a note. So, recalling the color wheel, we also know that every note in the chromatic scale can be organized into a wheel too. So, we simply overlap these two, and so we have a direct correspondence of color to notes. Then, the value of the color can give us the octave in which a note is. So, for example, a darker green will give a corresponding note in a lower octave, whilst the lighter green will be in a higher octave. And finally, the intensity of the color will give the intensity of the notes. To generate the parts, we use the categorization of temperatures. So cold colors will generate minor chords, while warm colors will give us major chords. And finally, to come up with the percussion, this is better explained than in the implementation part, but we use several information from the image and use these tables, which relate information from the image and musical information to a specific emotional state. So finally, with all these layers, we have something that may be considered in music. So for each painting, we generate two different artifacts. At the time of the submission, we only had these two versions. We currently have already worked on a third generation, which uses the genetic algorithm. To calculate the number of BPMs, as I said, we use the number of color variations. However, it was a bit challenging to us to actually relate the number of color variations to the number of pixels in the image. So we tried a different approach, where we calculate the average region size of the same color, which can be considered the opposite of the number of color variations. So the larger this average region size, the lesser color variations we have, and so a lower BPM, and vice versa. Then we understood that we would have to look at the image in a summarized way, so we couldn't analyze it pixel by pixel. So we divided it into same-sized rectangles, which we call quadrants. These are calculated according to the dimensions of the image. And as we know, in music, we also have same-timed divisions, which are the bars of the music. And so each quadrant will directly correspond to a bar. So for example, if an image is divided into 40 quadrants, our music will have 40 bars. So then we will analyze each quadrant individually. Every single pixel is grouped up into with other pixels of the same color, and the order of these groups is randomized, so it does not matter. So we have our two circles overlap, and for example, we have a quadrant which 50% of the pixels are blue, 25% are green, etc. And so 4 notes are generated in any possible order, and the duration of each note will depend on the percent and the frequency of that color in the quadrant. For the chords, now we have a difference between the raw and the harmonized version. So in our raw version, we simply analyze the most predominant color for each quadrant, and we directly translate it into a chord. So this will create our chord progression, where each quadrant has one specific chord. For the harmonized version, we decided that only 4 different chords will exist in the whole music. And so we count how many times each color is a predominant color in the whole image. We do its respective translation, and according to those numbers, we create a probabilistic function which will distribute then the chords throughout the music. To create the drum track, we decided to use a knowledge base with 42 different drum beats that are found in several popular rock music, such as Hotel California by the Eagles. By using the previous tables that we presented, we created a function that calculates an emotional value for each beat, and a function that calculates the emotional value for the image. And so for the raw version, we will calculate each quadrant's emotional value and find the beat which has the closest value to it. For the harmonized version, we will calculate the emotional value of the whole image, and we select the 2 closest beats to it, which are organized throughout the song. So, to evaluate the results of the system for this first version, so our first implementation, we simply asked people if they considered that it's generated artifacts for music, and furthermore, if they consider them as rock. We evaluated the music from these 2 paintings, and generally, most people consider it as music since, well, we use a pretty restricted, we restricted the results a lot. And on the other hand, if they were not considered as rock, which we considered that was due to the fact that we did not add a guitar, an electric guitar. We had some trouble simplifying it with MIDI, so it sounded really terrible, so we decided not to add it at all. Just to speak a bit about the second evaluation that we performed further on after submitting the paper, we already asked if people liked the artifacts and if they could somehow relate them to the paintings. So the evaluators did not know that these musics were generated automatically. They did not know that they were related to the paintings any way. We only told them about it after the fact. And actually we had pretty surprising results. So many people actually seemed to like the artifacts, and they could somehow find relations. And especially the broader movie had the best results, where people said that since it's such a minimalistic painting and repetitive too, so the music somehow could be easily related to the painting. So before I give some brief conclusions, I wanted to show you this after music. So this is the raw version of the Broadway Boogie painting. So we have a bass layer. The main sequence of notes is played in the piano and the drum track. So ideally, in the future, we could have an electric guitar to make it sound more like rock. Many people commented that the sound is like experimental music, ambient, electronic. Many people actually commented that it felt like jazz. Some people said that it sounds like elevator music, so I guess. So yeah. It is important to refer that this is just one possible analogy out of many different ones. It was proposed, we were the ones that created it, depended on our time constraints, it depended on our background, on our choices. For example, we consider that red is the first color, well, in the circle of colors, and that C is the first note, at least in our musical theory that we learned in Portugal, we start with the C note, so it was obvious to us to relate the red to the C and go from there on. So it is not the only one, it is not probably the right one, but it's a possible one. Even so, much work can still be done to improve both the analogy and the system. So, for example, changing the synthesization process either by not using MIDI or by actually using MIDI but with a better program, so that we could potentially add the electric guitar and actually try to make something that could sound as rock. Eventually add the addition of a music score being generated by the system, since we also consider that the results of the music that is generated could also be used by composers as inspiration so that they can themselves create music. So, for example, you have this sets of chords, you have these sets of notes, create the music from that. So maybe we are not so much interested in our music, but a composer will create something from that. More importantly so, many more features can be extracted from the image. We did a pretty abstract analysis of the image, only focusing on colors. So with more time, more resources, we could continue analyzing the visual feature. And on the other hand, adding more layers. We also wanted to generate the drum track from scratch, so not using a knowledge base and actually coming up with the drum beat. And yeah, that's it.
We have a little bit of time for questions and comments.
My interest was kind of piqued when you asked people, is this music? When you asked that question, you put into their minds the idea that it could not be music. And so suddenly your whole evaluation shifts a little bit. And so that made me wonder what the other staff is like. And I wonder if you have any other samples you can play.
Yeah, sure.
Because I didn't love more.
Sure.
Do you have the Mondrian one?
Sorry?
Do you have the Mondrian?
Yeah. Actually, this one that we listened to was the Mondrian one, so. Yeah, sure. This one, I think it's actually, I personally think that this painting is very relaxing and perhaps the music is too fast-paced. But I think that, well, since there are so many strokes and, well, the algorithm ended up seeing lots of color variations, so it has a really high tempo as a result. Yeah, I think it's definitely not rock, but I wouldn't know which genre to actually include it. Well, I should also refer that, as I said, this was done as part of my master's thesis, and recently I have done more work. So if you are interested in actually reading more about it, my website is on the paper, and you can download the whole thesis, listen to many more songs. Yes.
So this is very interesting work. I have my students do much smaller versions of this in assignment, so they're trying to see the research. One of the common role analysis is something like really ambitious goals. In this, and one would be like a version.
Yeah. So as I said, it's a pretty abstract analysis of the image. We ended up using mostly abstract paintings too. Eventually, maybe the possibility of object detection, emotion detection in the image to create a more closer emotional profile to the image, and the ability to actually use images with people in it, maybe a person that is crying, and the result is sad music. Eventually, in the future, where this is really well implemented and with many more features added to it, when I thought about this project, I was thinking of being able to generate soundtracks for games too. So, for example, procedurally generated games. So each level, the soundtrack is directly generated according to the background. Another possibility is when we are visiting a museum, we can actually listen to the song and accompany each painting from its respective song. So those were the main ideas that I thought that eventually in the far future it could be applied.
Yeah, there's a quite considerable literature in sonifying images. It goes from systems for blind people, and there's methods of systems like this for allowing blind to see. And those are using a scanning technique left to right, like you usually look at here, but typically, otherwise, higher level features tend to be used. Because if you think about it, people do not look at an image by looking at squares from left to right, top to bottom. So often you will find that the congruence between the music and the image will not be there. Any more questions and comments? There's one there.
One quick one. I wondered if you interviewed any people with synesthesia to see if they could maybe match up. It'd be interesting to do a matching, have the music and a bunch of paintings, and see if people could figure out which go with which.
Yes, we didn't do that. I thought about it, but later. So
okay.
we're finished this part. But yeah, but it's true. Something that crossed my mind, but unrelatable.
And any more questions, comments? I understand that Sophia and Joanna are new to the community, so it's really good to have you around. I even heard offline that you're converting yourself from, I guess, the business background.
No, I'm from the Islamic work community. Yeah.
On the 17th web, even better. 17th web.
I'm a yeah.
And that certainly deserves a round of applause. All right, so we wrap up the day, and maybe we have more announcements. the main thing is to note that the address of the manual gallery is easy to find online.